Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you for being here this afternoon in spite of all the rain. And for those of you in the internet, thank you for being here. Just to let you know that today we have two Torah portions. It's a double Torah portion, and let me write this down. I forgot to do this. The first Torah portion is called Nitzavim, and it's found in Deuteronomy 29:10. So it's Nitzavim, Deuteronomy 29:10 to chapter 30, verse 20. And then the other one is Vayelech, which is found in Deuteronomy 31, verses 1 through 30. And today is the last portion of reading of consolation. Today is the seventh consolation from Isaiah 61, verse 10 through 63, verse 9. So this is the seventh and last reading of consolation. And we'll be heading into the fall feast next weekend. So again, it's Nitzavim, which means you all are standing firmly. You all are standing firmly. Deuteronomy 29, verse 10 through 30, verse 20. And Vayelech, which means, and he walked or he went. Deuteronomy 31, verses 1 through 30. So let's start reading. Please go to Deuteronomy 29, verse 10. And remember that these are the last words that Moses is speaking to the people. Because in the next Torah portion, we'll be reading that he's about ready to die. Okay, so this is his last words. And remember that he's been doing a review of the covenant and of all the things that have happened during the 40 years in the wilderness, but especially speaking about the covenant. Why? Because he's trying to have the covenant reaffirmed, reestablished before the people go into the promised land. So in verse 10, it says, all of you stand today before Hashem your Elohim. So it's all the people standing, but in the Hebrew, it gives the understanding that they are standing in a firm manner, firmly. It says your leaders and your tribes and your elders and your officers, all of the men of Israel, your little ones and your wives, also the stranger who is in your camp, from the one who cuts your wood to the one who draws your water. In other words, every single individual is being taken into account, what he is about to say. Verse 12, that you may enter into covenant with the Lord your God and into his oath, which the Lord your God makes with you today. So in the Hebrew, it says you're crossing over into the land, and also you're crossing over into the covenant. So we have a physical, literal crossing over of the people into the land, but we also have a spiritual crossing over of the people going into the covenant at the same time. Because the purpose of the covenant is to perform the covenant in the land. And it says in verse 13, that he may establish you today as a people for himself, and that he may be God to you, just as he has spoken to you, and just as he has sworn to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Verse 14, I make this covenant and this oath not with you alone, but with him who stands here with us today before the Lord our God, as well as with him who is not here for us today. In other words, this is happening today for them, but it's also happening today for us, because he's taken into consideration the future generations and the future people that will also come into this covenant. So we're included in this. Okay, so when this was being proclaimed, it's happening at that moment in their today, but for us, it's our today. Okay, so he's even considering the future people that will come into this covenant. Verse 16, for you know that we dwelt in the land of Egypt, and that we came through the nations which you passed by. And you saw their abominations and their idols which were among them, wood and stone and silver and gold, so that there may not be among you man or woman or family or tribe whose heart turns away today from the Lord our God to go and serve the gods of these nations, and that there may be not be among you a root bearing bitterness or wormwood. In other words, what he's trying to say is, we have passed through all these nations, and you have seen how these nations worship these false gods. They worship the stones and the wood and all these things. And he says, let there be no one within your tribes, within your nation, within among you, that in their heart a desire comes to also do as the other nations, to be curious about the gods and the idols of other nations. Why? Because he says that little desire in your heart that is occult, that's in secrecy, eventually will become something that will bring bitterness and wormwood into your life. So it's going to start something small just because you're curious, but he says that's not a good thing. So in other words, cut it off from the beginning. Don't let that thing grow. And verse 19, and so it may not happen when he hears the words of this curse, that he blesses himself in his heart, saying, I shall have peace, even though I follow the dictates of my heart, as though the drunkard could be included with the sober. Now, first of all, what he's trying to say is, remember that these people have made an oath to this covenant. They have accepted this covenant. And so what he's saying, if there's someone that in their heart start desiring the idols and the false gods of other nations, he says, don't think that just because you promised and you made this oath, that nothing's going to happen to you, that you're still going to be blessed. He says that's not going to be the case. Even though you have made an oath to keep the covenant, but if in your heart you start desiring all these false gods and all these false idols, you will not be blessed. The curses will come upon you. And what they have translated as the end of the verse that says, as though the drunkard could be included with the sober, that's a really bad interpretation or translation, because what it says is that the watered soul become like the thirsty soul. In other words, the commentaries say that they're comparing the souls of the pagan nations as dry souls, while the souls of the Jewish people that are in covenant are watered. Why? Because they're being watered by the Torah. So he says, just because you're watered now with the Torah and the covenant, don't think that if you mix with these people and do like they do, that you will not become a dry soul like them. So it has to do with the watering of the Torah, and the nations that do not have Torah are compared to dry souls. So that's what that verse speaking about. It's not the way they have translated it. Verse 20. The Lord would not spare him. In other words, a person that desires in their heart to follow the gods of other nations, to follow the idols, the Lord would not spare him, for then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy would burn against that man, and every curse that is written in this book would settle on him, and the Lord would blot out his name from under heaven. And the Lord would separate him from all the tribes of Israel for adversity, according to all the curses of the covenant that are written in this book of the Torah, so that the coming generation of your children who rise up after you and the foreigner who comes from a far land would say, when they see the plagues of that land and the sicknesses which the Lord has laid on it. In other words, one thing that we don't think about is that this covenant that we do as individuals affects the whole community. The same way that whatever the community does in obedience or disobedience to the covenant is going to affect the individual. So he's saying people that stray away from the covenant and go into idol worship is going to bring also adversity to the land itself, because he says there's going to be plagues, there are going to be sicknesses. And it says in verse 23, the whole land is brimstone, salt, and burning. It is not sown, nor does it bear, nor does any grass grow there, like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and his wrath. In other words, breaking the covenant and falling into idol worship is going to bring all this even onto the land. You have to remember that the land that God is giving the people is a land that flows with milk and honey. It's a land of blessing. But he says, if you start going into idolatry, this land is going to be like Sodom and Gomorrah. It's not going to produce for you. It's going to be like if it had brimstone over it. And the problem is that the other nations are going to see what's happening, and then they're going to say the following. Verse 24, all nations would say, why has the Lord done so to this land? What does the heat of this great anger mean? Then people would say, because they have forsaken the covenant of the Lord God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. For they went and served other gods and worshiped them, gods that they did not know and that he had not given to them. Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against this land to bring on it every curse that is written in this book. So even the nations are going to understand that what's happening to the land, and we have to also remember that this did happen to the land of Israel when the people had to be exiled, when they were taken out of the land was desolate. There was nothing there. It was just sand, desert. There was nothing. So that did happen. And so the nations were saying, what happened to Israel? What happened to the promises? And they're going to, even the nations are going to understand that it was because the people broke covenant with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And all this was God's anger against his people for not obeying the covenant. And that's why it says in verse 28, and the Lord uprooted them from their land in anger, in wrath, and in great indignation, and cast them into another land as it is this day. In other words, breaking the covenant means exile, going into captivity. Why? Because God cannot be with a people that is not in agreement with him. You either walk with him or you walk against him. So God eventually had to get these people out of the land, exile. Verse 29, like I was saying last night, this verse is a verse that sometimes people misinterpret. Because it says the secret things belong to the Lord our God. And what secret things? What he's talking about here, remember, he's talking about idolatry. He's talking about the people straying from his covenant. So the secret things is in reference to sins committed in secret. So the secret things belong to the Lord our God. In other words, there's nothing you can keep secret that God will not know. Even if you do it in secrecy, any sin and idolatry, the Lord is aware of it. But those things which are revealed belong to us and to our children forever. In other words, what is revealed? The sins are done openly. And so it is the responsibility of the fathers and the children, when they recognize that someone is walking in sin openly because of covenant, we are obligated to go to those individuals and try to bring them back into the covenant. It is our responsibility. One thing we have to understand, that being in covenant, all of us, through Messiah Yeshua, we're all responsible for each other. Okay? We're not, we have to move and walk as a nation, as a unit. So whatever people do that's against the covenant and you see it and you recognize it, it's our responsibility to go to them and try to convince them or to make them repent or to make them try to let them see that they need to come back to the Lord. Okay? So that's what he's talking about. That's why it says at the end of the verse that we may do all the words of this Torah. The purpose of bringing the people back. If you see them sinning openly, but then those things that we don't see people doing, God sees them. So those things are not in secret to him. Because the purpose is that all together we are responsible for the covenant. In other words, it's accountability. Something that we need here today is accountability. Accountability with each other and accountability with the Lord. That's why leaders should always have someone to be accountable. If you go somewhere that no one is accountable to nobody, you should not go to that place. Here in this congregation, we're accountable to my dear friend and teacher, Rico Cortez. Okay, we're under his umbrella. And anytime I do anything wrong, oh, I assure you, he'll pull me away and let me know. Okay, so you have to always be accountable to someone. You just can't do your own thing the way you have to. That's responsibility. Like when Cain said to the Lord, am I my brother's keeper? Yes, we are our brother's keeper. Okay. Now, chapter 30 is very important. Chapter 30 is very important because for those people out there that believe in the concept of the rapture, which is not biblical, the way it's taught, This is the true rapture. Chapter 30 is the true rapture. So listen to this. It says, now it shall come to pass when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have said before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God drives you. Remember that the people had to be exiled. They had to go into all nations. And he says that in those nations, when you get blessing and when you get curses, and all of a sudden you remember the covenant, he says, verse 2, and you return to the Lord your God. That word return in Hebrew is shuv, from where we get teshuvah. Like right now, we're in the season of teshuvah. Even though they translate it as repentance, it's really not just repenting, it's a returning to God. Why? Because when we break covenant, we usually give our back to God and go towards everything else that's not God. So by doing teshuvah, that means you do an about face, you do a 180-degree turn, and you come back to the source, which is God, the source of life. So it says, when you return, when you do teshuvah to the Lord your God and obey his voice, according to all that I command you today, you and your children with all your heart and with all your soul. You cannot come back to the Lord halfway. You're either in or you're out, but you just can't come in and say, well, I'll do this, I won't do that. Maybe yes, no, you have to be firm. That's why it's called Nitzavim. You're standing before the King of Kings, the creator of heaven and earth, firmly in covenant. You have to be firm about what you promised, about the oath that you made. And it says, verse 3, that the Lord your God will bring you back from captivity, from exile. So where every place that he sent all these Jews into the nations, and you have to understand that there's a Jew in every single country in this world, okay? And probably that's why many of us are here today, because somewhere, at some point, one of our ancestors, who probably was a Jew or knew something about the Torah or whatever, repented and started rolling the ball in terms of us being here today. It's the calling of our DNA coming back to the covenant. So if we're here, it's because there's something in us that God called, and I have no doubt that it's within our DNA, calling us back to his Torah, calling us back, because you have to remember what he said in the beginning. Those standing here today and those that are not standing here today. In other words, the future. So the verse 3, that the Lord your God will bring you back from captivity, from exile, and have compassion on you, and gather you again from all the nations where the Lord your God has scattered you. Whether he sent you to Cuba, to Puerto Rico, to Chile, to Panama, to wherever. From there, he's calling back his people. And so that's why we're here today. Everybody is coming back. I don't know if you have ever looked into the history of the Messianic movement, of the Hebrew roots, if you want to call it, or Jewish roots or whatever, which kind of started in the early 90s. Since that point on, there's been more and more and more Messianic Jews joining, and the understanding that Yeshua is the Messiah. And those that have been in the church are coming out of the church into this knowledge, into the true knowledge of the Torah. Why? Because God is restoring all things to the way they were in the beginning. So that's why we're here. That's why we're doing Shabbat. That's why we're celebrating the feast. That's why we're studying Torah, because we're responding to this calling out of the nations. And the beautiful thing about this is that God takes us back, that God receives us with compassion and mercy and love. And he says, he'll bring you back from captivity, exile, and have compassion on you, and gather you again from all the nations where the Lord your God has scattered you. If any of you are driven out to the farthest parts under heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will bring you. Then the Lord your God will bring you to the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. He will prosper you and multiply you more than your fathers. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart. Now you have to understand that the term circumcise is referring to cutting away all that fatness that's over your heart, that's making you insensible to his word, insensible to his covenant, all that stuff that surrounds your heart, that's pride, that's vanity, that's sin, that's all the things that the world offers. And now God is taking all that away, ripping all that out of your heart, because he says, and the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. And remember that the term love is not only the emotional sense of feeling love for God, but love here is a covenantal term. Love has to do with being faithful and loyal to the covenant. That's what love means. When you love God, you're saying that you are faithful and loyal to his covenant. Verse 7, also the Lord your God will put all these curses on your enemies and on those who hate you, who persecuted you. And you will again obey the voice of the Lord and do all his commandments, which I command you today. The Lord your God will make you abound in all the work of your hand, in the fruit of your body, in the increase of your livestock, and in the produce of your land for good. In other words, you have to understand that being in covenant, coming back to the covenant, walking in the covenant, is not only blessing for you, but it's blessing for your whole family, for all your descendants. Okay, if you have children, that means children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great. I mean, because God says, those that love me up to the thousandth generation, which means forever. Okay, so this blessing keeps on going. It's like that little rabbit, keeps on going, you know, the battery thing doesn't stop. It says, for the Lord will again rejoice over you for good, as he rejoiced over your fathers. The same way that he had felt joy with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. Once we come back to him and come back in covenant through Messiah Yeshua, he also will rejoice with us. If you obey, verse 10, if you obey the voice of the Lord your God to keep his commandments and his statutes, which are written in this book of the Torah, and if you turn, in other words, shuv, teshuvah, if you shuv to the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, in other words, with your whole being. It's not just part of you. Everything has to be completely committed to this covenant and to the Lord. You just can't walk halfway. It's like you can't be halfway pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. So you have to be either in covenant or you're not. Okay? You have to be, it has to be completely. Your whole being, your thoughts, your lifestyle, your everything that you do has to be committed to the Lord and to his covenant. Why? Because that's what makes him happy. He says he rejoices with that. Okay? And then verse 11 says, for this commandment which I command you today is not too mysterious for you, nor is it far off. It is not in heaven, that you should say, who will ascend into heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. We have to understand that Moses, when he was on Mount Sinai and went in the presence of the Lord, that was basically, he was in heaven. He was in the throne room of the Father. But also we know that Yeshua came down from heaven, who's the living Torah. So we have two witnesses, not only Moses, but Yeshua brought the Torah from heaven and has taught us. We have heard it. Verse 13, nor is it beyond the sea, that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. Also, Moses crossed the Red Sea. He crossed the Red Sea. He went with the Torah. He brought the Torah to the people. Yeshua, how many times did Yeshua sit on the Sea of Galilee? Hundreds of times, teaching the Torah. So we have no excuse. We have Moses and we have Yeshua, who has brought us the Torah, who have spoken the Torah so that we can hear it and do it. And verse 14 says, but the word is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. We have to understand that every single day there's choices to be made, especially two. There's always two choices. Either you're going to walk in life or you're going to walk in death. Either you're going to walk in blessing or you're going to walk in curse. It's our choice. So he says, see, I've set before you today life and good, death and evil. In that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments, his statutes, and his judgments, that you may live and multiply. And the Lord your God will bless you in the land which you go to possess. But if your heart turns away so that you do not hear, and are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, and other gods can be anything that takes away God being the first place in your life. That can be your family, that can be your job, that can be your husband, that can be your wife, that can be your dog, that can be your cat. It could be anything that puts God in second place. That is an idol. That is idolatry. That is a false god. So it says, but if your heart turns away so that you do not hear, and are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I announce to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not prolong your days in the land which you cross over the Jordan to go in and possess. I call heaven and earth as witnesses. Always the witnesses of the covenant is the heavens and the earth. Why? Because they are eternal. Even though in some places you read that it says the heavens and the earth will pass away, that's not what it means. Heaven and earth will always be. They will be renewed, but not completely destroyed. So they're the witnesses forever. I call heaven and earth as witnesses today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. So he gives us the choices, and he's so good, just in case you still don't get it, that he gives you the answer. He says, therefore choose life. How difficult is it to choose between good and evil, between life and death? But just in case you don't know how to choose, he tells you choose life, that both you and your descendants, your seed, may live, that you may love the Lord your God. How many times has he said, love the Lord your God? Remember, that has to do with covenant language, faithfulness and loyalty, commitment. That you may love the Lord your God, that you may obey his voice, and that you may cling to him. That word cling in the Hebrew is davek. It's the same term that's used when a husband and a wife become one flesh. So clinging to God is like a husband and wife becoming one. We're that close to God that it's like if we were just one person, one individual. For he is your life and the length of your days, and that you may dwell in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. So this whole chapter 13, that is the rapture. Being exiled, being away from God, and wherever you were, at one point you came to know the knowledge of Yeshua, the Messiah. I'm sure many of us knew him as Jesus Christ, which is fine. But once you know that his name is Yeshua, that means salvation. Somewhere, wherever you are, you can probably remember exactly where you were, what you were wearing, how it happened. From there, God started calling you, and now he's bringing you into this covenant knowledge and understanding, because he wants us back, because that's the promise that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that is the true rapture, bringing us back from where we were, back into his covenant, for all the places that he drew us away. Bringing us back was the purpose that eventually, at one point, we will all be in Israel. Now, chapter 31, here this is really the last words of Moses. Now there's going to be a transfer of leadership. And it says, then Moses went and spoke these words to all Israel. And he said to them, I am 120 years old today. Now the understanding is that Moses dies the same day that he was born, the 7th of Adar, which is, I think, was 2488 in the Hebrew calendar, the 7th of Adar. And the understanding is that when a person dies the same day that he's born or she is born, that means they had a full, complete life. And not only that, it also means that usually people that die on the day they were born are considered to be righteous because they had the blessing of living a full, complete life. So it says, I am 120 years old today, and I can no longer go out and come in. In other words, he can't go out to war or bring the people in. Not because he was old and he was decrepit and he couldn't do anything. It was because God said, this is it. This is your last day. Because up to this point, Moses was still strong. His vision was okay. His health was okay. Even though he was 120 years old, he probably felt like 40. Okay? So it wasn't because he couldn't continue. It's just that God said, your time is up. You already fulfilled what I asked of you. Now is the turn for Joshua to do it. He says, also the Lord has said to me, you shall not cross over this Jordan. You have to remember that God said, you're not going over into the land. Even though he wanted to, and he pleaded, and he said all these things, God said, sorry, time's up. Verse 3. The Lord, now remember that he's speaking to the people. You also have to remember that Moses has been with the people since they came out of Egypt. And there's still people living that had come out of Egypt. He has been a leader to them. He has been a counselor. He has been a friend. He has been a father. He has been a warrior. He has been there for everything for the people. So now this is what he's saying to them. The Lord your God himself crosses over before you. He will destroy these nations from before you, and you shall dispossess them. Joshua himself crosses over before you, just as the Lord has said. So he's letting them know they're not going to be orphaned. They will have Joshua or Yehoshua, who's the one that's going to lead them into the land. They won't be alone. Verse 4, and the Lord will do to them as he did to Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, and their land when he destroyed them. In other words, if they were able to destroy these big kingdoms, they know that it is God is going to continue fighting the wars for them, that they're going to be able to dispossess the lands of the Canaanites. Verse 5, the Lord will give them over to you, that you may do to them according to every commandment which I have commanded you. Be strong and of good courage. Do not fear, nor be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, he is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. And that verse, like I was saying last night, if God has given you a mandate, if God has put something in your heart for you to do, whether you have started or planning on doing it, that verse is for you. Because whatever that God leads you to do, he says, be strong and of good courage. Do not fear, nor be afraid of them. Who's them? I assure you, once you start walking and doing something for the Lord, all the unimaginable obstacles in the world will come against you. You'll have enemies that you didn't even know you had. Obstacles, sickness, things will break, a whole bunch of things. Because anytime you start walking and trying to do things for the Lord, all hell will break loose. But he says, do not fear nor be afraid of them, for the Lord your God, he is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Verse 7, then Moses called Joshua and said to him in the sight of all Israel. So now he's speaking directly to Joshua. Because remember that this is kind of like a ceremony where Moses it's giving his leadership into the hands of Joshua. He says to Joshua, be strong and of good courage, for you must go with this people to the land which the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give them, and you shall cause them to inherit it. And the Lord, he is the one who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Do not fear nor be dismayed. So the same words to Joshua. And then Moses says in verse 9, so Moses wrote this Torah and delivered it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. In other words, he wrote the Torah, a scroll. You have to remember that in the ark, you had the broken pieces of the first tablets that God wrote, and then you had the second set of tablets that God also wrote. And now Moses has written a scroll of the Torah. And so this scroll has to be put to the side of the ark, the original. And then the elders will make a copy of it. Why? Because as they go into the land in certain areas within Israel, there's going to be a copy of the Torah. Verse 10, and Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, in other words, the Shemitah. Remember that the cycle of 7 years is called the Shemitah, the last 7th year. It says at the appointed time in the year of release, because you have to remember that in the Shemitah year, all debts were canceled, properties were returned, slaves were freed. So he says every Shemitah year, at the appointed time, at the Feast of Tabernacles, during the Feast of Sukkot, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses, which is Jerusalem, you shall read this Torah before all Israel in their hearing. So every 7 years, while the temple was standing, the people had to, not the people, but to the people, the Torah had to be read, because remember that Tabernacles is a 7-day feast. So 7 days is enough time to read the whole Torah. So the people would come from the morning till the evening and listen to the Torah as it was being read and taught. But the one who read the Torah out loud was the king. And you also have to understand that no one can sit in the temple premises except the king, a descendant of David. So that means that the people were standing all day long for 7 days listening to the Torah. He says, gather the people together, men and women and little ones, and the stranger who is within your gates, that they may hear and that they may learn to fear the Lord your God and carefully observe all the words of this Torah. So the purpose of reading the Torah to the people every 7 years is so that they can hear it, they can learn to fear the Lord, observe all the commandments of all the words of this Torah, and that their children who have not known it may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God as long as you live in the land which you crossed the Jordan to possess. So even the little children had to listen. And that's something that we even today need. People that do not study the word, do not listen to the word, especially young people or children, they do not learn to fear the Lord. And fear is not that you're afraid of him. Fear is that you are in awe of him, in reverence, respect for him, honoring him. So it's also important that the children hear and listen to the Torah. Verse 14. So this has to be a public reading. Then the Lord said to Moses, behold, the days approach when you must die. Call Joshua and present yourselves in the tabernacle of meeting, that I may inaugurate him. In other words, the Lord himself is going to commission Joshua as the leader of the people. But they have to do it in the tent, in the tabernacle. So Moses and Joshua went and presented themselves in the tabernacle of meeting. Now the Lord appeared at the tabernacle in a pillar of cloud, and the pillar of cloud stood above the door of the tabernacle. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, you will rest with your fathers, and this people will rise and play the harlot with the gods of the foreigners of the land, where they go to be among them, and they will forsake me and break my covenant which I have made with them. So now the Lord is telling Moses what's going to happen to the people once he dies. Can you imagine the heart of Moses after all these years teaching the Torah, teaching the people, being with them, to hear and know that after he dies, everything is going to go haywire? And he says in verse 17, then my anger shall be aroused against them in that day, and I will forsake them, and I will hide my face from them, and they shall be devoured. Another thing you have to remember when it says that God will hide his face, to see the face of God is to see light, because the face of God is light. So if he hides his face, that means that we find ourselves in darkness. So as best as you can, avoid having God hide his face from you, because it's better to be dead than to have God hiding his face from us. And he says, and many evils and troubles shall befall them, so that they will say in that day, have not these evils come upon us because our God is not among us? Of course, exile. And I will surely hide my face in that day because of all the evil which they have done in that day, in that they have turned to other gods. Now therefore, write down this song for yourselves and teach it to the children of Israel. Put it in their mouth that this song may be a witness for me against the children of Israel. So God is telling Moses, after he tells them these people are going to do whatever they want once you die, I need you to write this song and teach it to them because this song is going to be a witness. Of course, the song we'll study it next time. And it says, verse 20, when I have brought them to the land flowing with milk and honey, of which I swore to their fathers, and they have eaten and filled themselves and grown fat. In other words, they go into the land, they have all the blessings, they have all the food they want, they have all the best. Then they forget God, like many people do. Once they have abundance, they don't even think of God. But once they go into need, then they remember God. And we must not do that way. We should be grateful in good times and in bad times. Don't wait for the bad times to come. If you can praise him, extol him, and honor him while you have something, you will also do it when you won't have anything. When I have brought them to the land flowing with milk and honey, of which I swore to their fathers, and they have eaten and filled themselves and grown fat, then they will turn to other gods and serve them, and they will provoke me and break my covenant. Then it shall be, when many evils and troubles have come upon them, that this song will testify against them as a witness. For it will be not forgotten in the mouth of their descendants. For I know the inclination of their behavior today, even before I had brought them to the land of which I swore to give them. So God knew they were going to mess up. The same way he knew that Adam and Eve were going to mess up. The same way he knows we've been messing up. But still, he is a merciful, compassionate, loving Elohim. Verse 22, therefore Moses wrote this song the same day, in other words, the same day that he was also going to die, and taught it to the children of Israel. Then he inaugurated Joshua the son of Nun and said, be strong and of good courage, for you shall bring the children of Israel into the land of which I swore to them, and I will be with you. So it was when Moses had completed writing the words of this Torah in a book, of course it wasn't a book, it was a scroll, when they were finished, that Moses commanded the Levites who bore the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, saying, take this scroll of the Torah and put it beside the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there as a witness against you. For I know your rebellion and your stiff neck. If today, while I am yet alive with you, you have been rebellious against the Lord, then how much more after my death? Gather to me all the elders of your tribes and your officers, that I may speak these words in their hearing, and call heaven and earth to witness against them. Again, heaven and earth as witnesses. So he has to teach the song to the elders and the officers, and then these people are going to teach it to the rest of the tribes. For I know that after my death you will become utterly corrupt and turn aside from the way which I have commanded you, and evil will befall you in the latter days, because you will do evil in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger through the work of your hands. So they know, Moses knows, Joshua knows, that the people are going to break the covenant once they get into the land, and once they feel happy, they got blessings, they got abundance, and once they have their filling, they'll forget God. Okay, so this song is going to be a witness, and we know that there's at least two songs of Moses. The first song was when they crossed the Red Sea, which was the song of victory. And we also know in the book of Revelation that Moses and the Messiah will also sing a song of victory. So Moses was apparently a pretty good songwriter. So with that, we have the two Torah portions for tonight, and we're going to take some time to for questions or comments, if anybody has questions or comments.